Albert Speer, often referred to as the Good Nazi, was one of Adolf Hitler's closest confidants and served as the Third Reich's chief architect. Born in 1905, Speer initially seemed destined for a quiet life as an architect, but that all changed when he attended a Nazi rally in 1931, where he first encountered Adolf Hitler. Instantly captivated by the Führer, Speer became a member of the Nazi Party and quickly ascended through its ranks. Before long, he was Hitler's favored architect, tasked with designing grandiose monuments and buildings that would symbolize the power and longevity of the Third Reich. Speer's early ambition was to etch his name in history through architectural marvels that glorified the Nazi regime. His goal was to redesign Berlin as a global capital, turning it into Germania, a sprawling city filled with monuments that would rival the great capitals of the world. Speer's vision for Germany wasn't just about architecture, it was about immortalizing the Nazi ideology in stone. He sought the Führer's approval and craved recognition as a visionary, willing to use his architectural genius to serve one of history's most destructive regimes. Speer's journey to glory, however, was linked with the darker realities of the Third Reich. As World War II erupted, his role shifted from merely designing buildings to overseeing the Nazi war machine. After Fritz Todt, the previous Minister of Armaments, died in a suspicious plane crash in 1942, Speer took over Todt's position. This was a crucial turning point. In this new role, Speer was not just building monuments, he was building the machinery of war, overseeing factories, armaments, and logistics. Here's where the myth of Albert Speer, the Good Nazi, starts to unravel. While he later claimed to be an apolitical technocrat, Speer was fully aware that his factories were powered by the labor of thousands of prisoners, Jews, political dissidents, and other undesirables, subjected to inhumane conditions, starvation, and death. He may have been an architect by trade, but during the war, he became an architect of suffering. When Speer became Minister of Armaments and War Production, he fully embraced his role. He wasn't just building factories, he was overseeing a vast, brutal empire of forced labor. Under his watch, hundreds of thousands of concentration camp prisoners were worked to death. Speer's factories were a vital part of Hitler's war effort, and they were fueled by the blood and sweat of countless innocent lives. He relied heavily on slave labor, primarily drawn from concentration camps like Auschwitz. These prisoners worked under unimaginable conditions, often without food or rest, until their bodies gave out. As the war dragged on, the toll of Speer's efficient war machine became evident. His armament factories might have produced the materials necessary for the Nazi war effort, but they came at a tremendous human cost. Many prisoners died from exhaustion, malnutrition, and mistreatment. In camps like Mittelbau-Dora, workers were forced to produce the V-2 rockets in underground tunnels. The conditions were so harsh that thousands perished from overwork and disease. The bodies piled up as Speer continued to push for higher production numbers, indifferent to the human cost. Speer knew what was happening. He was no naive bureaucrat caught up in events beyond his control. The records show that he regularly visited these sites, witnessing firsthand the horrific conditions. Yet, he never intervened. In fact, he encouraged this labor system because it kept his factories running, even as the war dragged on and able-bodied German workers became scarce. The myth of the Good Nazi falls apart under scrutiny. Speer wasn't just complicit in these crimes, he was an integral part of them. He managed the logistical framework that allowed the Holocaust to function. While he may not have been directly involved in the mass extermination, his hands were stained with the blood of those who died under his watch in the brutal factories and camps. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, the full extent of Nazi atrocities was coming to light. The Nuremberg Trials, held to bring Nazi war criminals to justice, seemed like an inevitable death sentence for Speer. After all, as Hitler's architect and Minister of Armaments, his involvement in the war effort and the Holocaust was undeniable. Men like Hermann Göring and other high-ranking Nazi officials faced the death penalty. But in a stunning turn of events, Speer avoided execution. How did Speer manage to escape the fate that awaited so many others? Speer's survival is one of the most controversial aspects of the Nuremberg Trials. Unlike Göring and other unrepentant Nazis, Speer took a different approach. In a masterful act of self-preservation, He positioned himself as the good Nazi, the technocrat who was merely doing his job, unaware of the full extent of Hitler's genocidal plans. During his testimony, Speer famously accepted moral responsibility for the crimes of the Nazi regime, but he stopped short of admitting personal guilt. He presented himself as a remorseful figure who had been swept up in the machinery of the Nazi state. In truth, this was a carefully crafted performance. Speer was an intelligent man, fully aware of what he had done and what he needed to say to save his own skin. He distanced himself from the most egregious crimes of the regime, painting himself as a loyal servant to the Führer who had been too preoccupied with his work to notice the horrors unfolding around him. It was a brilliant defense, one that allowed him to appear both complicit and innocent at the same time. Speer's charm, intelligence, and well-calculated remorse worked. The Nuremberg judges, perhaps eager to show that not all Nazis were bloodthirsty monsters, spared him the death penalty. Instead, Speer was sentenced to 20 years in prison, where he would spend his time writing memoirs and cultivating his image as the Nazi who regretted his actions. But the reality is far darker. Speer's ability to escape execution was not because he was less guilty than his peers, but because he was more adept at manipulating the narrative. He used the Nuremberg Trials to present himself as a reformed man, fully aware that the judges were more likely to show leniency to someone who expressed regret. He exploited the chaos of the post-war world and played on the desire for a quick resolution to the trials. The harsh reality. Albert Speer's crimes were monumental. The forced labor system he oversaw resulted in the deaths of countless innocent people. His factories, built on the backs of slave laborers, were complicit in the extermination of millions. But because of his cunning and his ability to manipulate perceptions, he escaped the fate that befell so many of his colleagues. Speer spent his post-war years cultivating the myth of the good Nazi, giving interviews and writing books that reinforced the idea that he was a man who had been caught up in events beyond his control. But Speer was far from innocent. The truth is that he knew exactly what he was doing, and he was fully aware of the human cost of his actions. The workers who died in his factories were as much victims of the Holocaust as those who perished in the gas chambers. The only difference is that Speer's crimes were hidden behind the facade of industrial efficiency. The reality of Speer's legacy is that he was a master manipulator, a man who used his intelligence and charm to escape justice. His involvement in the Nazi war machine was undeniable, and his crimes were horrific. But through his carefully crafted narrative, Speer managed to evade the ultimate punishment. While others were executed for their roles in the Nazi regime, Speer lived a comfortable life after his release from prison, dying peacefully in 1981. A stark reminder of the ways in which history can be rewritten by those clever enough to escape its grasp. Albert Speer's story is a chilling example of how one man, responsible for so much death and suffering, managed to rewrite his own history. By positioning himself as the good Nazi, Speer was able to escape execution and live a life that was, by all accounts, free from the consequences of his actions. But the reality of his crimes cannot be ignored. Speer was not just an architect of buildings, he was an architect of human misery, complicit in the forced labor system that killed so many. Speer's survival and his ability to craft a false narrative of redemption should serve as a reminder of the dangers of revisionist history. He may have escaped execution, but he could never truly escape the blood on his hands. The myth of the good Nazi is just that, a myth carefully constructed by a man who knew exactly how to manipulate the truth to save himself.